In an opulent, high-end restaurant, a progressive waitress mocks Chuck Norris, unaware of Barron Trump's presence nearby. As the waitress ridicules the iconic action star, she soon finds herself in an awkward and shocking situation when Barron intervenes. The unexpected turn of events leaves the entire dining room in stunned silence. The aroma of truffle oil and seared wagyu filled the grand dining hall of Le Magnifique, a restaurant frequented only by the elite. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light as waiters in white gloves served dishes worth a fortune. Among them was Sophie Carter, a young waitress with sharp wit and even sharper opinions. She had worked there for a year but never grew fond of the wealthy clientele. To her, they were all the same, privileged, untouchable, and oblivious to the struggles of ordinary people. At a corner table, an older gentleman with a beard and piercing eyes sat quietly sipping his espresso. He looked familiar, but Sophie didn't bother to place him. Instead, she whispered to a fellow waitress, giggling, "Imagine thinking Chuck Norris is still relevant. The guy's just a meme at this point." A quiet chuckle came from a nearby table. Sophie turned, her stomach tightening as her gaze met the sharp blue eyes of a young mantle, composed and strangely familiar. It was Barron Trump. The air in the restaurant grew heavy, as if a storm was brewing. Barron didn't move or speak, but his presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere. His security detail stood close, their trained eyes scanning for threats, but none could anticipate the storm in his gaze. Sophie, unaware of the gravity of her words, smirked. "What? Am I wrong?" The young Trump heir finally spoke, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of something deeper. "You don't know what you're talking about." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. The guy's just some washed-up action star." The entire restaurant seemed to exhale in discomfort. Chuck Norris, still silent, stirred his espresso. His face betrayed nothing, but something in his stillness made even the waiters uneasy. Barron leaned forward slightly. "You think legends fade just because you stop looking?" His words sent a chill through Sophie's spine. Before she could reply, the maitre d' approached with an urgent whisper in her ear. "Step outside for a moment, now." Something was happening, something she couldn't yet see. Outside, Sophie found herself face to face with two of Barron's security guards. They weren't aggressive, but their mere presence was intimidating. The maitre d' sighed, rubbing his temples. "Do you realize who you just mocked?" Sophie folded her arms. "Some old guy who thinks he can still fight." The maitre d' looked at her, his face pale. "Chuck Norris isn't just an actor, Sophie. He's a man who's dedicated his life to helping others. He's trained military forces, rescued kidnapped children, and—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "He once saved Barron's life." Sophie blinked. "What?" Inside the restaurant, Barron stood up, his gaze locked onto Chuck Norris. There was something unspoken between them, something deep, something powerful. Sophie's heart pounded. She had stepped into a story far bigger than she had imagined, and it was only beginning. Sophie's pulse quickened. The maitre d's words clung to her mind. He once saved Barron's life. Inside Le Magnifique, the air felt heavier. Guests whispered. Chuck Norris remained calm, stirring his espresso, while Barron's icy blue eyes never left Sophie. She took a shaky breath. "What do you mean he saved Barron?" The maitre d' sighed. 5 years ago, an attempt was made on young Barron's life. The Secret Service was overwhelmed. Out of nowhere, Chuck Norris stepped in. He took down 3 armed men and armed himself. He glanced back toward the table. Without him, Barron wouldn't be here today. Sophie's throat tightened. She turned toward the restaurant. Chuck looked peaceful, like a man who carried no pride in his actions, only purpose. Barron, however, was different. He looked hurt. Slowly he stood, tucking his chair in. His voice was quiet but strong. "Do you know what it's like to owe someone everything?" Sophie swallowed hard. She had made a mistake, a grave one, and she was about to face the consequences. Barron stepped forward. His security detail tensed but did not intervene. He didn't need them right now. Sophie's palms were sweaty. "You didn't know," she stammered. Barron exhaled slowly. "No, you didn't." He studied her. "But you spoke anyway." His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The entire restaurant was silent, hanging on to his words. Chuck Norris remained seated, calm as ever, but his expression was unreadable. Barron took another step forward. Mr. Norris is more than a legend. He's more than a meme. He's a man who has spent his life protecting people even when no one was watching, even when no one cared. He paused, even when it meant risking his own life. For me, Sophie's stomach twisted. Regret clawed at her chest. I made a joke, she whispered. Barron's gaze hardened. And sometimes, jokes cut deeper than you realize. Tears burned at Sophie's eyes. She had judged Chuck Norris without knowing anything about him, and now the weight of her words felt unbearable. Barron turned away, his voice softer. Maybe next time, you'll think before you speak. Chuck Norris finally placed his espresso cup down. The clink echoed through the silent restaurant. Barron, he said, his voice calm. Let's not be too harsh. Barron hesitated, but Chuck raised a hand. People speak from what they know. He turned to Sophie, his eyes gentle. And sometimes, what they know is limited. Sophie's knees felt weak. Chuck Norris, her childhood punchline, the subject of internet jokes, was showing her kindness. More kindness than she deserved. I'm sorry, she choked. I didn't mean to. Chuck nodded. I know. For the first time in her life, Sophie felt truly small, not because of power or wealth, but because she had judged someone so wrongly. Barron, still tense, exhaled slowly. Apologizing is one thing. Learning from it is another. Sophie wiped a tear from her cheek. I will. The weight in the restaurant shifted. Something unspoken had changed. But this was only the beginning. Sophie felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. The elegant chandeliers above shimmered, casting light on her burning face. She had never been so humiliated. Barron Trump's words still echoed in her mind. Maybe next time you'll think before you speak. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them down. No, she wouldn't cry here. Chuck Norris stood, adjusting his jacket. His movements were slow, deliberate. Then, with the ease of a man who had seen too much of life to hold grudges, he looked at Sophie and said, Come, sit with us. Her breath caught. What? What? Barron frowned. Chuck, Chuck raised a hand, silencing him. The best way to learn about people, he said, is to listen to them. The restaurant was so silent, Sophie could hear her heartbeat. Slowly, unsure of what was happening, she walked forward. As she sat across from the two men she had mocked and misunderstood, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she was about to listen, not judge, and she had no idea how much it would change her. Sophie sat stiffly in the chair, her hands gripping the linen napkin in her lap. She had served rich men before, powerful figures who barely acknowledged her, but never had she been invited to sit with them. Chuck Norris leaned back, his eyes kind but knowing. You think you know me, don't you, Sophie? Sophie hesitated. I thought I did. Chuck smiled slightly. Then let me tell you what you don't know. Barron crossed his arms but remained silent. Chuck's voice lowered. I wasn't born famous. I wasn't born strong. I was a scared little boy from Oklahoma, bullied for being weak. I had nothing until I decided to change that. Sophie swallowed. This wasn't what she expected. I trained, Chuck continued. I failed. I lost. I got back up. And along the way, I learned that strength isn't about power. It's about purpose. Barron finally spoke. It's also about who you choose to protect. Sophie's heart pounded. Chuck nodded. That's why I stepped in that day. Not because Barron is the son of a president, but because he was just a kid. Sophie's breath hitched. She had never thought of him that way. And suddenly, she wasn't sure she liked the person she had been. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. What happened that day? Barron looked at Chuck, who nodded. Then, with a deep breath, Barron spoke. I was 13, he began. I was in a hotel lobby waiting for my mother. The Secret Service was there, but his jaw tightened. They didn't see him. Sophie felt a chill down her spine. Who? Chuck's expression darkened. A man with nothing to lose. Barron's fists clenched. He pulled a weapon. He got too close, too fast. The restaurant seemed to shrink around them. Chuck's voice was quiet but firm. I was there by chance. I saw it before they did, and I did what needed to be done. Sophie's stomach twisted. She had mocked this man, called him irrelevant, and yet he had saved a boy's life. Barron's voice wavered. If he hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here. Sophie couldn't stop the tears this time. For the first time in her life, she truly understood. Sophie stared at Barron, her breath uneven. The boy in front of her, the man, now wasn't just the son of a president. He was someone who had faced death and lived with its shadow. "I never knew," she whispered. Barron exhaled. Most don't. His voice was steady, but there was something behind it, something heavy. Chuck Norris, silent until now, finally spoke. "People assume they know everything about you when they know your name." He glanced at Sophie. "You assumed about me, about Barron." Sophie felt small, not because they were famous, but because she had been so blind. Barron looked away, his jaw tightening. "Everywhere I go, I'm watched. Not just by security, but by the world. They expect me to be someone before I even know who I am." Sophie had never thought of it that way. She had mocked him, his family, his life, without knowing the cost of it. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time, she saw Barron Trump not as a name, not as a headline, but as a person. The restaurant air felt heavier, as if the weight of unspoken words pressed against them all. Sophie wiped her eyes, ashamed. "I judged you," she admitted. "Both of you, without knowing anything." Chuck Norris gave a small nod. "Most do." Barron leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the table. "Do you know what it's like to have friends betray you because of your last name?" His voice was quieter now. "To have people hate you not for what you've done, but for who you are." Sophie shook her head, her heart aching. Barron continued. "When I was 15, I had a best friend. Or I thought I did." His voice hitched slightly, but he pushed on. "He came to my house, ate at my table, met my family. I trusted him." Chuck Norris looked at Barron with quiet understanding. Barron's hands curled into fists. "Then one day, I found out he was selling stories about me to the media. Fake ones, personal ones." His jaw clenched. "He wasn't my friend. He was just using me." Sophie's stomach turned. She had laughed about Barron before, mocked him, but she had never considered what it meant to live in his world. And now, she wished she had. Sophie's heart felt like it was breaking. For so long, she had mocked people like Barron and Chuck, thinking they were untouchable. But now, she saw the scars they carried. Barron studied her. "So what now?" Sophie looked down, ashamed. "I don't know." Chuck Norris spoke, his voice as calm as ever. "You can't change the past, but you can decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward." Sophie looked at him, eyes wet. "I don't want to be who I was before tonight." Barron nodded slowly. "Then don't be." It was that simple, that powerful. For the first time in years, Sophie felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just sorry. She was ready to change.